Welcome back to another episode of Mastering Diagnostics with yours truly, Brandon Steckler, Technical Editor of Motor Age Magazine. Today I want to follow up on a previous video that we did pertaining to the functionality of a catalytic converter and what it needs to work properly. I called the video, "A Well-Fed Cat is a Happy Cat." Today we're going to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty details around how the components of the fuel control system and the fuel feedback system work together to make sure that catalytic converter is happy. Now, the first thing I want to do is make mention that newer technologies implement software strategies as well as new components to help accomplish some goals that we weren't capable of accomplishing in years past simply due to the limited functionality of the components that were at play. What I mean by that is this. The Zirconia type oxygen sensor that we used for decades is still very accurate, as it's always been. Matter of fact, some manufacturers have gone away from it and in recent years have come back to its implementation in their fueling strategy. But the takeaway from me telling you that is that the Zirconia style oxygen sensor, the one that goes up and down and up and down across our scan tool graphs, is very accurate only to within a very narrow range, very slightly above and below that stoichiometric air-fuel ratio for gasoline that we know and we're familiar with of 14.7 to 1. Just slightly rich of that, closer to 12 to 1, for instance, that oxygen sensor immediately is going to switch high. And just above that, at air-fuel ratios that exceed 14.7 to 1, the oxygen sensor signal is going to switch low. So I equate that to an analogy that I like to use that makes sense to me. And if you could picture yourself standing in the middle of a field surrounded by trees and attempting to operate a radio-controlled airplane. Now, as long as we can keep within visual line of sight of that airplane, we can maintain control of it. But if that airplane dips below the tree line somewhere in the horizon and we can no longer see it, we don't stand a chance at controlling where it goes because we don't know. So this is where the wideband air-fuel ratio sensor and the software that helps monitor it and keep it working comes into play. Now, you can look at a wideband air-fuel ratio sensor from this angle, if you'd please. This is how I remember it. Now, although this isn't technically accurate, it's a good visual representation to help keep your mind wrap around its functionality. Now, I have to begin that explanation by first mentioning the operation of a narrowband or Zirconia-style oxygen sensor. The zirconium dioxide element within this thimble has a characteristic or property to it. Two things. One, it wants to maintain oxygen equilibrium on either side of it. And two, as oxygen migrates through this zirconium dioxide element, it is a galvanic cell. What that means is it creates its own voltage. So if you could picture my two hands for a moment here as representing the zirconium dioxide element inside the sensor's thimble. One hand here is touching the air outside, atmospheric air, and it's referencing it for oxygen content. And my other hand here is inside the exhaust string, sampling the exhaust gas oxygen content. Now, in relatively lean conditions, high oxygen content, the oxygen content found in the exhaust stream more closely matches the oxygen content found in the atmosphere. They're similar to one another. Now, as I mentioned, the zirconium style oxygen sensor wants to find equilibrium between what's in here and what's out here. But since they're both similar, not much oxygen has to be pulled from the atmosphere and put into that reference chamber. So since not a lot of oxygen has to migrate, the sensor does not produce a lot of voltage. Hence the reason under lean conditions we see the Zirconia style oxygen sensor signal output be relatively low, say near 200 millivolts. Now, on the flip side of the scale, when we are dealing with a rich mixture, an exhaust stream that lacks oxygen content, the oxygen content out here in the atmosphere is significantly higher than the oxygen content found in the exhaust stream. And as a result, the zirconium element wants to migrate or pull oxygen from the exhaust stream into the sense cell referencing the exhaust stream. As that oxygen content crosses the zirconium dioxide barrier, it generates a voltage. And this is why under rich conditions, we see oxygen sensor signal outputs closer to 900 millivolts. Now, I told you all that to preface what I'm about to tell you regarding the operation of a wideband sensor. We can read pages and pages and pages of documentation on sensor functionality, written more so at an engineering level. Many times that does us as technicians no good because they're speaking way outside our level of understanding. So I'm going to try to put it into an analogy that works well for me, and I'm hoping it works well for you. Now, if you can picture the oxygen sensor, the wideband air-fuel ratio sensor, as being two oxygen sensors put into one, it has a couple of different operating characteristics. First, it has a heating element much like a typical classic design oxygen sensor because we have to maintain a certain temperature for this sensor to be functional. Second, it has a sensing cell, much like an oxygen sensor. That's a galvanic cell that outputs a voltage. And it also has an oxygen ion pumping cell, which uses electricity, electrical current, to move oxygen. So here's how that works. If you could picture two oxygen sensors put into one, they serve two different purposes. That same transitioning signal that you or I tend to see, the goal is to maintain that voltage at about 450 millivolts. And that sensing cell is referencing the exhaust system. Now, if that exhaust system starts to go lean and there's more oxygen content in the exhaust stream, it's going to take that oxygen sensor 450 millivolts and start driving it downward below 450 millivolts. Now, since the goal is to maintain 450 millivolts, how do we pick that transitioning low signal back up to 450? We have to get rid of some of the oxygen in that sense cell. So this is where the oxygen ion pumping current comes into play. Picture a man with a shovel moving coal. Now, instead of coal, we're going to use oxygen molecules. There's a man standing there with a shovel at that nursed cell. When the PCM sees that 450 millivolts drop low, it's an indication that we have to remove some oxygen content from that nurse cell. So the man with the shovel is going to take a scoop of oxygen and throw it over his shoulder to get it out of that nurse cell. And that should bring that signal back up to 450 millivolts. He's going to keep shoveling until that signal comes up to 450 millivolts. Now, on the flip side, if the oxygen content in the exhaust stream is deficient, like it is during rich conditions, that 450 millivolts is going to tend to transition high. And the man with the shovel, to bring that back down to 450 millivolts, he's going to take a scoop of oxygen. But he's not going to throw it this way. Instead, he's going to turn around and he's going to grab a scoop of oxygen and shove it back into the nurse cell. Because as we shovel oxygen back into the nurse cell, that oxygen sensor signal that was riding up here near 900 millivolts is going to come back down. So what does that have to do with anything? The PCM is monitoring the man with the shovel and his activity. The PCM wants to know two things. What direction is the man shoveling oxygen? And two, how hard is the man working? Now, if you were to reference this picture right here, I've drawn a scale. As you can see, 0 milliamps represents 14.7 to 1, or stoichiometric air-fuel ratio. for gasoline. That cross-references to about Lambda 1.0, which we learned from previous videos, is the perfect air-fuel ratio, the ideal stoichiometric air-fuel ratio for any fuel. With that, the oxygen sensor signal at that point should be approximately 450 millivolts. Now, as the oxygen sensor signal transitions lean, the man with the shovel is going to have to start enriching the mixture by pulling oxygen out. So what you see here in blue is the man shoveling oxygen out of the nurse cell. And the more oxygen he has to move, the harder he has to work, the further up that blue line is going to reach, the more positive milliamp value is present. And on the flip side, during rich conditions, the man has to turn around the other way. He's facing in a negative direction now, and he has to pump oxygen molecules back in. That's represented by the red line. The more oxygen molecules he has to pump in, the harder he has to work in that negative direction, the further away from 0 milliamps that man travels. The negative current value increases. So in the end, the PCM is simply looking at the current, which direction the current's heading, and how far away from 0 milliamps that current has transitioned to directly correlate to an air-fuel ratio as rich as 0.78 to 1, which is about 22% rich, to as lean as about 1.64 to 1, which is 64% lean. A much wider detection range than a narrowband sensor. And that is why they are referred to as wide-range air-fuel ratio sensors. I told you all that to tell you about a road test I took with a vehicle of mine, an '09 Acura RDX with a 2.2-liter engine. Being an '09, this vehicle is about 15 years old. Technically, it's pretty old technology, but even back then, with the implementation of the wideband air-fuel ratio sensor, we had a lot more control. We can drive this vehicle under operating conditions that would typically put older technologies. It would typically put that vehicle into open loop operation, meaning we would disregard the oxygen sensor input. With today's vehicles, and even something as old as 15 years old, with the implementation of the wideband air-fuel ratio sensor, we can maintain closed-loop operation even under heavy acceleration. But it also offers the opportunity for us to implement something called rear fuel trim. Now, again, we learned in previous videos that short-term fuel trim was a corrective factor made because the oxygen sensor input indicated either a rich or a lean condition. The direct result of that was short-term fuel trim, and it's a corrective factor. As that short-term fuel trim corrective factor continued to occur over and over again under the same operating conditions, the PCM has the ability to learn that trend over time, and that corrective factor moves out of a short-term correction into a long-term correction, meaning every time the vehicle enters that load and RPM range of operation, that long-term fuel trim corrective factor will take over. The short-term corrective factor is a reactive response to a problem, whereas a long-term corrective factor is a proactive response to a problem. It takes action before a symptom is exhibited, and that's how we keep the vehicle within emissions tolerances. And then there's rear fuel trim, which we've yet to talk about. Rear fuel trim would be like stepping on this doctor's scale. As I step on the scale at the doctor's office, the doctor is going to take the heavy weight and he's going to move it over one click. With any luck, he won't move it over 2 clicks, but that heavy weight represents 100 pounds. If he moves it to 200 pounds, again, with any luck, the scale's going to bottom out and we've gone too far. So the doctor will move it back to 100 pounds. And that's when he gets out his pen and he starts to tap the little weight to make a fine-tune adjustment to help determine how much my body weight is. That's how the balance scale works. Being able to tap that little weight with your pen, that's pretty similar to how rear fuel trim works. True, it is a corrective factor, but it's a very minute corrective factor that maximizes the catalytic converter's functionality, maximizes its lifespan, and also helps to correct for minute deficiencies that are occurring within a degrading catalytic converter. Now, we can also capitalize on this for emissions purposes. Suppose that I was driving a vehicle down the road under steady state throttle at a minimal amount of load, say a flat highway at a cruising speed. There's no need for fuel demand because there's not a lot of load on the engine. So to save fuel mileage, manufacturers can start taking away some of the delivered fuel. Because of older technologies, we were forced to maintain an air-fuel ratio very close to stoichiometry. It wasn't because the catalytic converter couldn't function outside that narrow band. Just like flying a remote control airplane, if we can't see it, we can't control it, because the oxygen sensors will immediately transition high or low if we deviate too far away from stoichiometry. We can't see any further rich or lean than just outside 14.7 to 1. But the wideband air-fuel ratio sensor lets us do that. Not only can it show us rich or lean, it can also show us how rich or how lean. I equate that to no longer operating a radio-controlled airplane, but now we are operating a drone with a camera. And we can make that drone go miles and miles away and still maintain control because we can now see where we are going. Since that possibility now exists with newer technologies and the software that accompanies it, we can begin to take away or add to the existing air-fuel ratio on what we desire to accomplish. For instance, if we wanted to save on gas mileage, we could remove some of the delivered fuel by reducing the injector pulse width slightly. What's that going to do? It's going to increase our air to fuel ratio and cause a slightly lean condition. As long as we are monitoring the operation of the rear O2 sensor, we can see if that cat is doing its job, the same job we learned about in that previous video, to store and use oxygen. And as long as oxygen is not coming out of the catalytic converter in abundance, it proves that the cat is still functioning. On the flip side, we might have a vehicle that tends to produce a lot of oxides of nitrogen. Again, reference that previous video if you want to know more about how catalytic converters function. But in the case of fuel control, we can use the fuel as a quenching agent to remove heat from the cylinder. All we have to do is slightly reduce the air-fuel ratio, say from a stoichiometric air-fuel ratio of a Lambda 1.0 to maybe 0.99 or 0.98 within 2% rich of Lambda. That alone can spray the additional fuel to remove the heat energy from the cylinder and remove oxides of nitrogen from that combustion event. So I want to take a moment and I want to reference some information here. I want you to take a look at this capture. This capture is of several parameter identifiers that I logged on a vehicle of mine during that road test. Both short-term and long-term fuel trim for this 4-cylinder engine, the activity from the oxygen sensor, the commanded air-fuel ratio, and the actual air-fuel ratio being measured by my wide-range air-fuel ratio sensor. And just for sport, I included predicted catalyst temperature. Now, I colored these other three black because I don't want to pay too much attention to them right now. I just want you to focus on the activity from the post-catalyst oxygen sensor. That's right, oxygen sensor number 2, and how it has influence on the commanded air-fuel ratio. As the oxygen sensor transitions, you are going to see transitions to the commanded air-fuel ratio, what we call equivalence ratio. And as I transition through this road test, you will notice the oxygen sensor start to transition. As the oxygen sensor starts to dive low like that, closer to 420 millivolts, the reaction would be to take the commanded air-fuel ratio sensor and negate it as well, which would be adding fuel or removing oxygen. In other words, enriching the mixture. As we enrich the mixture, the rear O2 sensor is going to start to increase, just like that. And as it starts to increase, the reaction from the PCM is to command an equivalence ratio above stoichiometry, one that would be much more lean. And what that's going to do is drive the rear O2 sensor down. So overall, I just want you to be aware that long-term and short-term fuel trim still exist for the reasons they've always existed, as a corrective factor to a temporary problem, and then a long-term corrective factor to trends learned over time. But we now have to factor in rear fuel trim, because rear fuel trim is used to optimize catalytic converter functionality, maximize its life, and help it to recover as it starts to degrade over time. I'm Brandon Steckler, Technical Editor of Motor Age Magazine, and I thank you again for joining me on this episode of Mastering Diagnostics. We'll see you on the next one.